The house on Maple Street had always stood apart from the others. Its sagging wooden frame and dark, unlit windows were a stark contrast to the neat, orderly homes that lined the block. Children rarely played near it, and adults seldom spoke of it. But for as long as Laura had lived in the neighborhood, she had felt its pull. There was something about the house, something hidden beneath its decaying walls, that whispered to her in the dead of night. A strange sense of longing, as though it were waiting for her to uncover its secrets. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the horizon, Laura found herself standing before the house. It was a quiet evening, the kind where even the birds seemed to hold their breath, but the air was thick with something she couldn't quite name. The door stood ajar, its once golden handle tarnished with time. She hesitated, then pushed the door open further, the creak of the hinges sending a chill through her spine. The inside of the house was shrouded in dust and shadows. The air felt stale, untouched by time, as though the house had been waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. Laura stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under her weight as she ventured deeper into the dim hallway. The house stretched out before her like an old, forgotten memory, with peeling wallpaper, rusted light fixtures, and a sense of desolation that seemed to seep from every corner. She paused as she reached a door at the end of the hall. A strange feeling washed over her, like a faint, muffled whisper just on the edge of her hearing. A pull. She couldn't resist. She had to open it. With a hesitant hand, Laura turned the doorknob, the click echoing in the quiet house. The door opened into a small room. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, casting long, uneven shadows that stretched across the walls. At first, she thought it was just an empty room, but then she saw the chair. It was an old armchair upholstered in dark, faded fabric, sitting at the far end of the room. Its back was to her, and the seat was slightly worn, as though someone had sat there often. But it wasn't the chair itself that made Laura's stomach tighten. It was the way the room seemed to close in around her when she looked at it, how everything else seemed distant, quiet, forgotten, except for that chair. A faint whisper seemed to brush against her ear. She turned sharply, but no one was there. Her heart began to pound, but something about the room, about the chair, held her captive. The whisper returned, this time clearer, closer. It wasn't a voice she recognized yet. It felt familiar, like a distant memory resurfacing after years of being forgotten. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was undeniable, a soft, coaxing invitation. Compelled, Laura stepped into the room. As she approached the chair, she noticed something strange. There was a thin layer of dust on the floor, but in front of the chair, the dust had been disturbed, as though someone had been sitting there not long ago. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked, and she felt the room shift, the air growing heavier with each step. Her hand reached out almost on its own to touch the armrest of the chair. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, a cold shiver ran up her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and for the first time, she realized how completely silent the house had become. The only sound now was the thundering of her own heartbeat. A low creak came from the chair, as if someone had shifted in it, but when Laura looked, the chair remained empty. The air thickened, suffocating her, and the whisper returned. It was no longer a distant murmur, but a clear, insistent voice. "Sit," She froze. The word hung in the air like an unspoken command. Her legs trembled beneath her, and her mind screamed at her to leave to run from the suffocating pull of the room. But her body moved of its own accord, as if tethered to the chair by some invisible force. Before she knew it, she found herself sitting in the chair. It was a deep, heavy seat that seemed to hold her in place, as though it were made for her and only her. The moment she sank into the cushions, she felt it a rush of cold air, followed by a sense of weightlessness, as if the room itself was shifting, spinning. The walls around her seemed to close in the shadows, growing deeper, thicker. The whispers grew louder, no longer incoherent, but now pleading, demanding. Laura's eyes began to dart around the room. But no matter where she looked, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, forming dark shapes in the corners of the room. Her heart thudded in her chest, panic rising as she tried to move, but she was trapped in the chair, unable to break free. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to ripple, as if the very room itself was breathing. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice that seemed to echo from the walls, from the very bones of the house. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was harsh, filled with something dark and ancient, as though it had been waiting for her, watching her all this time. The room was no longer just a room. It was alive, feeding on the fear that had begun to twist and coil inside her. In the silence that followed, she could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, holding her in place. The room had become her prison, and the chair, once a seat of rest, had become the place where everything began. Everything had been leading up to this moment, and there was no escape. The air around Laura grew colder still, thick with an unnatural chill that seeped into her very bones. She could feel the pressure building within the room, the walls stretching inward, pushing against her, closing her in. The whispers, now a chorus of distorted voices, circled around her, but they no longer felt like distant echoes. They were inside her mind, clawing at her thoughts, urging her to stay in the chair. The very fabric of the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its presence overwhelming. "You shouldn't have come," the voice repeated, more insistent, now the words dripping with venom. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as the realization slowly crept in. This was not just a house, it was something much older, something that had been waiting for years, decades, centuries. It had seen many faces, many souls, and now it had settled its gaze on her. The chair seemed to grow heavier, its cushions pressing into her as though it were a living thing. The seat, once inviting, now felt suffocating its embrace, unyielding, cold as death. Her legs felt numb, her arms stiff at her sides, unable to move, trapped in the thickening fog of fear. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a dry whisper, barely audible. Who are you?" She managed her words, trembling in the stifling silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy stillness, and then in a voice so deep, so ancient, it made her bones ache. The house responded. "We are the watchers, the keepers. We are the ones who wait, and you." The voice trailed off, its tone shifting as though the words were being carried on a cold wind, a gust that ruffled the air. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken around her, swirling like dark smoke, and she could see figures, now shapes barely discernible, in the corner of her vision. They lingered there, just outside the reach of her gaze, watching her with hollow, unseen eyes. Laura strained against the weight of the chair, her mind screaming for escape, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't move. She couldn't even twitch a finger. The house had her locked in place, and the more she struggled, the more she could feel herself slipping, her mind hazy and distant, as though something was slowly draining her of herself. The whispers grew louder, their meaning clearer now. Stay with us. Stay forever. A shiver ran down her spine as the words wrapped around her like chains, locking her in the chair, anchoring her to the room, to the house. She realized then that this wasn't just a room, it was a trap. A prison for those who dared enter a place where time ceased to exist, where souls were bound to the house, trapped for eternity. Laura's thoughts began to slip away from her, each whisper weaving a darker thread into her consciousness, pulling her deeper into the house's grip. She could feel it now, an overwhelming presence, an ancient power that had been waiting for her, watching her, calling to her. A shadow detached itself from the wall, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. It was tall, its form shifting and flickering in the dim light as if it couldn't quite hold its shape. It stopped just in front of the chair, and for a moment Laura could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing down on her chest. "You are ours now," the voice whispered, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It was right in front of her, as if the shadow itself had spoken directly into her ear. Her eyes widened in terror as the shadow loomed closer, its form becoming clearer. Its face was a mass of darkness. No features, no eyes, just an endless void that seemed to pull at her soul. It reached out a hand, or rather an appendage, something dark and slick that seemed to melt out of the air itself. Laura gasped, trying to push away, but the chair held her firmly in place. Her body was no longer her own. It was a puppet to the will of the house. The shadow's tendrils wrapped around her cold as ice, sliding along her arms, her neck tightening as they wound themselves around her like living ropes. She could feel her breath faltering, her chest tightening under the pressure. Her mind screamed, but no sound came. The whispers were louder now, filling her ears, her thoughts. "Stay," they said. "You're home now, forever." With each passing second, Laura felt herself slipping away, her consciousness dimming like a flickering candle. The more the shadow tightened its grip, the more she felt herself fade, consumed by the darkness that had waited so long for her. There was no escape. There never had been. The chair began to move again, creaking and groaning under her. But now it wasn't just the chair shifting. The room itself seemed to be shifting with it, the walls bending and warping, stretching like elastic under the pressure of the ancient force that now owned her. The final whispers echoed around her clearer than ever. "Stay with us. Stay. Forever." The chair stopped moving and the room fell silent. Laura was gone. Story 2. The Ghosts of Willow Creek. The town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by dense forests and winding rivers, it was the kind of place where people came to escape the noise of the world, or perhaps to hide from it. The town had a quiet charm, but there was something else, something beneath the surface that kept it at a distance from the outside world. Most outsiders didn't stay long, and those who did quickly learned that there were some things about Willow Creek that no one ever spoke of. Sophie was not an outsider. She had grown up in the small town, spent her childhood running through the woods, playing by the creek, and listening to the stories of old that the townsfolk told in hushed voices around the fire. Her mother had always told her that the stories were just that, stories. Tales meant to entertain, not to frighten. But as Sophie grew older, she began to wonder whether the town's reluctance to talk about its past was hiding something darker. It had been years since Sophie had left Willow Creek, but when her mother fell ill, she returned. The old house was just as she remembered: creaky floorboards, faded wallpaper, the scent of pine in the air. Her mother's illness was slow, and it left her bedridden with only faint memories of the past. Sophie found herself tending to her mother, cleaning the house, and returning to the rhythm of life that she had left behind. But as the days went on, something started to feel wrong. The town, which had always felt so familiar, now seemed distant, even eerie. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the trees, Sophie took a walk down the familiar path that led to the creek. The water was low this time of year, and the banks were lined with wildflowers, their colors muted by the fading light. It was peaceful here, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She walked the path slowly, her thoughts wandering back to the old stories. Stories of strange happenings, of people disappearing, and of the mysterious lights seen hovering over the creek at night. The townspeople had always dismissed it as superstition, but Sophie had heard the stories too many times to ignore them. The older generations spoke of the ghosts of Willow Creek, restless spirits that roamed the town after dark, unable to find peace. Sophie had never believed in such things, but now, standing on the banks of the creek, she couldn't help but feel as though the town itself was watching her. As the light dimmed, Sophie decided to return to the house. She turned to head back, but something caught her eye: a figure standing on the other side of the creek. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the trees. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard any footsteps, but there he was, staring at her from across the water. She called out, but there was no response. The man simply stood there, motionless. His presence felt unnatural, like a shadow that didn't belong. Sophie's heart raced as she backed away, but as she did, the figure slowly disappeared, swallowed by the growing darkness. She quickened her pace, heading back to the house, but as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. It wasn't just the figure at the creek. It was the way the town seemed to close in around her, the quiet streets now feeling oppressive, suffocating. The trees along the path seemed to lean toward her, their branches like fingers reaching out from the darkness. When she returned to the house, her mother was asleep, her breathing shallow. Sophie sat in the kitchen, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The town had always felt peaceful, but now it felt like a place trapped in time, as if some force was holding it together, refusing to let go. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and Sophie found herself staring at it, her thoughts drifting. Her mind wandered back to the creek, to the figure she had seen. Who was he? And why did he seem so out of place? As the night wore on, Sophie tried to push the thoughts aside, but they clung to her like a fog. She made her way upstairs to her room, the creaky stairs familiar underfoot. Her mother's illness was progressing, and Sophie had to focus on that. not on the strange feelings and the ghost stories of Willow Creek. But as she lay in bed, sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Sophie closed her eyes, but the sound of whispers seemed to fill the room, faint at first, then growing louder. The wind's voice seemed to weave in and out of the whispers, but there was something else, something not quite natural in the sound. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were real. They came from downstairs. Sophie's legs felt heavy as she got out of bed, her mind screaming at her to ignore it, to go back to sleep. But she couldn't. She had to know what it was. She crept downstairs, the house silent except for the whispers that seemed to echo from the shadows. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she felt a cold gust of air sweep through the hallway, and the whispers stopped. The house was empty. She walked through the darkened rooms, her footsteps soft on the wooden floors. Everything seemed still, lifeless. And yet, there was a heaviness in the air, a presence that she couldn't explain. She stood in the middle of the living room, listening, waiting for the whispering to return. But it didn't. She stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow moved. It was quick, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. She spun toward it, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shape. Just the empty space in the corner of the room. The town of Willow Creek had always been quiet. But tonight, Sophie realized it was hiding something. Something ancient. Something that had been here long before her. The whispering began again, only this time it wasn't in the house. It was outside. The whispering outside grew louder. A faint murmur that seemed to come from the trees themselves carried on the wind. Sophie felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up, and her heart began to race as the sound grew closer. The voices were soft, almost too quiet to understand, but they weren't coming from a single place. They seemed to encircle her, coming from every direction. She could feel their presence all around her, wrapping around the house like an invisible fog. Her first instinct was to lock the door, but Sophie's feet remained frozen to the floor. The air in the house grew thick, heavier than before, as if the weight of the night itself had taken root in the walls. The floorboards creaked under her feet, and the temperature seemed to drop with each passing second, the chill creeping into her skin. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as she moved to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. The yard stretched out in front of her, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something movement far off in the distance, just beyond the edge of the yard where the forest began. A figure. It was a tall man, but his features were blurred, indistinct. He stood still facing the house, his figure barely visible in the murky light. The wind howled again, carrying with it that strange, almost mournful whisper. But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting, watching. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should turn away, close the curtain, lock the door, but her feet were rooted to the floor, her mind paralyzed. The figure remained staring at her house with an eerie stillness, his presence a dark shadow in the night. Sophie's fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle, but the whispers, now louder and more insistent, filled her mind, pushing her toward the door. Before she could open it, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward each step, calculated his feet sinking into the grass with a soft crunch. He moved closer to the house, the darkness swallowing him with each stride. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening as she watched him draw nearer, his form now unmistakably clear. He wore a long coat, the edges tattered, and his face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer into her very soul. Sophie stumbled back, her legs shaking beneath her as she backed away from the window. The figure was so close now, standing just outside her door, staring at her through the glass. His eyes were dark, empty, and for a moment, Sophie swore. She could hear the whispers coming from him as though they were emanating from the very depths of his being. "Who are you?" she whispered to herself, but the words died in her throat. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand, his long bony fingers pressing against the window pane, and Sophie's blood ran cold. The hand, cold and skeletal, left a mark on the glass as though it had been pressed into the very fabric of the world. The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling degree. Sophie's breath fogged up the glass as she backed away, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the darkness, suffocating her. Then, as if the world itself had held its breath, the figure began to disappear. His form seemed to fade, as though the very shadows were swallowing him whole. His outline blurred, and within seconds he was gone, leaving only the faintest traces of his presence behind. The handprint on the window remained cold to the touch, a faint, ghostly image that lingered like a memory. The whispers too faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Sophie stood there for a long moment, her mind racing, her heart thundering in her chest. What had just happened? Who was that man, and why had he come? She stumbled backward, shaking uncontrollably. The house felt different now. No longer just a quiet refuge. It felt as though it was alive with something ancient, something waiting. The wind outside began to howl again, the trees groaning in the distance. Sophie's eyes darted to the window, and she saw nothing. The yard was empty, the figure gone, as if he had never been there at all. But the handprint on the glass remained a cold reminder of what had just transpired. She rushed to the door, locking it tightly. Her mind was a storm of questions and fear, but one thing was certain. She wasn't alone here. The town of Willow Creek had never truly been peaceful, and now it felt as if its past was coming back to claim her. The whispers began again, soft at first, but steadily growing louder. They were no longer outside, they were inside the house, seeping into the walls, crawling under the floorboards. They were everywhere. Sophie clutched her chest, her breath quick and shallow as the realization hit her. There was something in Willow Creek that had been waiting for her, something that lived within the very fabric of the town. And it wasn't just the land, it was the people, the spirits that had never left, the ghosts of Willow Creek, and they were coming for her. Story 3: The Curse of the Harper Family. The Harper family had always been the pride of the town. Their mansion, perched on a hill just beyond the edge of the village, stood as a testament to their wealth and influence. Generations of Harpers had lived in that grand house, the sprawling estate passed down like a sacred heirloom. To the townspeople, they were a symbol of tradition, unshakable, untouchable. But beneath that facade of power and respectability lay something darker, something older. The legend of the Harper family curse was one of the town's oldest whispers. It was said that every few generations, one of their own would be chosen, though not in any way that could be predicted or understood, to fulfill a dark bargain made long ago. The pact made in the shadow of their rise to wealth bound the Harpers to a malevolent force that demanded its due. But as the years passed, the stories faded into the background, dismissed as folklore, and the family lived on, unchallenged. Yet as with all legends, the truth had a way of resurfacing. Rachel Harper had spent the first 30 years of her life in the mansion, and she had heard the stories. Her grandmother had often whispered of the curse in the dead of night, her voice shaking with fear. She would speak of it as though it were a force beyond their control, a shadow that had followed the family through generations. But Rachel never believed it. She thought it was just an old woman's superstition, her way of holding on to the past. That was until the day her father died. It had been a slow decline, a sickness that no one could explain. He had grown weaker by the day, pale and gaunt, as though the life was being drained from him. And when he finally passed, it was without warning, without mercy. The doctors had offered no explanation, and the family had accepted it with little more than a muted sense of loss. Rachel inherited the house, the sprawling estate, and everything that came with it. But soon after her father's funeral, strange things began happening. At first, it was small things moved in the night. The furniture slightly shifted, as though someone had been in the room when she wasn't looking. But then it escalated. Doors would creak open at odd hours, and faint whispers could be heard in the halls just at the edge of hearing. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting. Rachel told herself it was nothing, her mind playing tricks on her, perhaps a result of the stress and grief. She convinced herself that she was simply imagining things, that the weight of her inheritance was taking a toll on her. But there were moments when the house grew still and silent, when she could feel something watching her, something older than time itself, waiting for her to understand. One evening, as Rachel wandered the long hallways of the mansion, she found herself in the library. It was a large room filled with dark wood shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of old books and dust. She had always loved this room, had spent countless hours reading in the silence. But tonight there was an unsettling stillness in the air. It felt as though the room was waiting for something. Rachel's eyes wandered to the old leather-bound books on the far shelf. She wasn't sure why, but something about one of the books called to her. She moved closer, pulling the heavy volume from the shelf. The spine cracked as she opened it, and the first page was covered in strange symbols, ancient, intricate designs she had never seen before. The text was written in a language she didn't recognize, the letters flowing like a river of ink. As her fingers traced the symbols, a sudden chill ran through her. The air grew cold, and the whispering returned louder, now more insistent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the words, the symbols, and then, just as quickly as the chill came, it was gone, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in its wake. Rachel slammed the book shut and put it back on the shelf, her hands shaking. What was happening to her? She could feel the weight of the curse, the dark shadow that seemed to hang over the family, closing in on her. She had inherited more than just the house. She had inherited whatever ancient power had followed the Harpers for centuries. The whispering grew louder, as though it were coming from within the walls themselves. The very foundation of the mansion seemed to groan under its weight. Rachel felt trapped, unable to escape the oppressive force that filled the room, pressing in from all sides. That night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, the house grew quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the beating of her heart, the occasional creak of the wood beneath her. And then in the distance she heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she strained to listen. The voice was soft but unmistakable. "You're next." The words chilled her to the bone. She sat up, her pulse racing, but when she looked around the room, there was no one there. Just the empty walls, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The house was silent again, but the words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over like a mantra. "You're next." Rachel knew then that the curse was real. She had no doubt anymore. Something was coming for her, something that had been waiting for generations. And she was the next one to pay. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and an increasing sense of dread that seemed to hang over Rachel like a dark cloud. The whispering was constant now, filling the corners of the house, creeping into her thoughts. She could feel its presence in every room, in every creaking floorboard. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. Every time she passed a mirror, she swore she saw something just behind her, a shadow moving in the periphery of her vision. But when she turned, nothing was there. She tried to keep her mind occupied, throwing herself into managing the estate, but it was impossible to escape the growing sense of impending doom. The house had begun to feel like a trap, and every time she wandered its vast hallways, she could feel the eyes of her ancestors on her, their presence palpable in the still air. They had once been the masters of this land, but now she realized they were prisoners, too trapped by the pact they had made, bound to the house by the curse they had invoked so long ago. Rachel's thoughts kept returning to the strange book she had found in the library. The symbols, the ancient language, everything about it felt wrong. She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were hidden somewhere within those pages. But as much as she wanted to understand what was happening, a part of her was terrified of discovering the truth. She was already too deep into this, already marked. The voice had told her she was next. It was only a matter of time. One evening, unable to sleep once again, Rachel ventured back into the library. She stood before the bookshelf, staring at the leather-bound volumes. The air was thick with the musty scent of old paper, but she didn't hesitate. Her fingers brushed over the books, and when they landed on the one she had pulled down earlier, she felt a surge of cold run through her body. The book was heavier than she remembered, as though it had gained weight since she last touched it. She opened it again, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. The symbols seemed to writhe in the candlelight, shifting and changing as though they were alive. Her eyes darted to the margins, where the text was written in a flowing script she couldn't comprehend. But there, at the bottom of the page, was something she could understand: a name. Harper. It was her family name, and it was written over and over again as though it had been inscribed into the very fabric of the book itself. Rachel felt a chill creep down her spine as she traced the letters with her finger. The name was not just a signature. It was a mark, a binding. The more she read, the clearer it became. This book, this ancient text, was a ledger of sorts, an account of the pact her family had made, and every generation since had paid the price. The cost was always the same: a life, a sacrifice. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in around her. Rachel felt the weight of the book in her hands, its power coursing through her like electricity. She couldn't stop reading, couldn't tear her eyes away from the words that seemed to burn themselves into her mind. The last page was marked with a symbol, one she recognized from the mansion's walls. It was the same symbol that had appeared in her dreams, the same one that had been etched into the wood of the doorways. A spiral twisting inward as though it was pulling everything toward its center, a force that would consume everything in its path. Rachel's heart began to race. She could feel something moving in the room, something behind her, something ancient. She turned her head slowly, but the room was empty. The house was quiet again, but the whispering was louder now, no longer distant but inside her mind. "You are the next." The words reverberated in her skull, filling her with a cold dread. She slammed the book shut, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The weight of it, the truth of it, was unbearable. She wanted to flee, to leave the house and never look back, but something inside her refused to leave. She had to face it. She had to finish what had been started generations ago. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, each second stretching into eternity. The walls seemed to close in on her, and for the first time, she understood the true horror of her family's legacy. The pact wasn't just a story. It wasn't a myth. It was a chain, a binding that held the Harpers in a grip stronger than death itself. And now it was her turn. Rachel stumbled backward, clutching the book to her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely alone, trapped in a house that was more a tomb than a home. She couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let her. The whispers grew louder still, now a chorus of voices chanting her name, calling her to the center of the house, to the place where it all began. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the very air thick with something dark and alive. Rachel knew what she had to do. The book had shown her the way. The cycle had to be completed. Her blood, her life was the price. But even as the weight of the truth pressed down on her, part of her resisted. Part of her wanted to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But there was no running, not anymore. With a deep breath, Rachel turned toward the door, toward the hall that led to the heart of the house. The house that had been built on blood, on sacrifice. The house that would claim her as its next offering. The whispers followed her, urging her onward as she stepped into the darkness.